Welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe. I'm an advisor, author, and general explorer of the service and experience space. My guests tend to have just released some interesting research. They run a company that has some interesting tech in the service and experience space. They are part of an organization that is doing some cool stuff, or they run their own business doing interesting things for both their customers and or their employees. That's enough from me. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have an old friend of the podcast and an old friend too. It's Ari Weinzweig, who is the CEO and co-founding partner of Zingerman's community of businesses out in Ann Arbor in Michigan. Ari, my old friend, how are you, sir?
I'm already good and better for seeing you.
Brilliant. So I never assume that people listen to all the podcasts and therefore are familiar.
That's a good
with
assumption.
It. Yeah. So I was like, these are just episodes. They just exist in the ether.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily connected, but they are connected in my mind and my heart because we've spoken a number of times. And you also collaborated with me on the Punk XL book. So
yeah,
you're family, sir. That's what I'm going to say. But for people that don't know Zingerman's and don't know yourself, can you introduce yourself, sir?
Yes, I can. Well, in your context, what we have in common, aside from a passion about customer experience, or we would say great service here in American English, you and I also, of course, have a alignment around anarchism and around punk rock. So, just for context, those are the latter two are things that don't always come up in every podcast, but here they can be front of mind.
Yeah.
So Zingerman. So we're in Ann Arbor, Michigan. For those who don't know the town, if they're in the UK, I might say it's a little like Cambridge or Oxford. It's a university town, about 100,000 people. We're about 3 hours drive to the east of Chicago and about an hour west of Detroit, just to sort of place us on the people who have a vague image of American geography. It's very cold here right now. So that's
and a big football team too.
It is a big football team, which is not the center of my emotional life, but it is the center of economic life in the autumn. So the stadium is the largest in the country, and every home football game, more people go into the stadium than live in the town. So just to give people an image. But anyway, long story short, I came to Ann Arbor from Chicago. I went to school at the university. I studied Russian history, which is a very painfully poignant major to have had over the recent years. And I also studied anarchism. And when you come here, you should go to the anarchist collection because it's the largest in the country. Just the hours aren't very service focused, but they're up there, and there's some amazing, amazing material that I used to literally go, up there when I was a student and study like pamphlets from 1900. It's incredible. You can't take pens in, only pencils.
Right. I tell you what, it's that we've talked a lot about, as you say, we have a shared interest in all sorts of things, anarchism, punk rock, but also about great service and how that and customer experience, call it what you will. But we've also talked about you're also a very reflective human being. You write a lot, and that's always how you kind of you think about things as you write. I mean, I'm similar in that I'm not prolific in the terms of the output that you've done. If you don't know how much Ari's written, then you should go and check out Zingerman's and the bookstore and all these things, because it's volumes. I mean, literally volumes of this stuff, and it's most of all of it rather is all based on Ari's experience and his thoughts and his kind of thinking and his meeting of other people and things, and it's gold. You should go and mine it sometime. But the thing out there that you've published something recently, and it's a little bit, I guess, left field, one could say. When we like left field things in terms of applications to the whole service and experience sort of like space. Because you recently published this new, and I say in inverted commas on an audio sort of recording, a new book called Life Lessons I Learned from Being a Line Cook.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to, and some of those things, I mean, I think it's 18 different life lessons.
Yes.
And I wanted to explore a few of those because I think they're just relevant for the space that we're in. But before we want to do that, because you mentioned pamphlets,
Yes.
And I love different formats of books and stuff, and how actually what's interesting, how we, in a modern, very digital environment, we sometimes lose the lessons of the past and how publishing has delivered things in different formats to different audience for different
Yes.
means and different objectives. And the book that you've written is it's very short, but it's in a format that you describe as being a chap book. And I was like, a chap what? And so I was like, I actually had to go look up what's a chap book. I understand what a pamphlet is, but a chap book is like, I didn't know what that is. So can you tell me what a chap book is? Because that's
yes,
cool.
and I didn't finish the story of who we are either. They left me as I was a college graduate, but then here I am on your
I cut you off.
podcast.
I'm sorry.
No, you didn't cut me off. I just paused and then we started going on another subject. So after graduating with my history degree, we do a lot of work around visioning, which you and I have talked about in previous podcasts, but aren't really going to get into today. But I had no vision at all. Only what David White, who lived in England, not that far from the other side of the border of where you are, I think, writes about, he calls it the via negativa. This is where you're clueless about where you want to go, but you're very clear on where you don't want to go. And I knew I didn't want to go home. And so I ended up trying to find a job at the restaurant that one of my college roommates was waiting tables at, not because I loved food or business. I just needed money to pay my rent, something that most people in life have experienced at some point or another. Long story short, after applying 3 times, I got a job washing dishes, which fairly quickly, in hindsight, having hired dishwashers for 40-something years now, I was a good dishwasher, and I got, not shockingly, promoted to line cook.
Right.
And now my lifelong friend, Frank Carollo, was a line cook. He's going to be at the event I'm doing this evening about the chapbook because he started training me how to cook. And
excellent.
And so that's where the chapbook begins. And it's also in a way where this whole conversation goes. But long story short, again, I worked for that restaurant group for about 4 years total. In the fall of 1981, I reached a point where I was not sort of punk rock rebellion, but less and less inclined towards what that organization was doing. It wasn't a terrible job, but it wasn't inspiring. And so I just decided, you know what, it's time to do something else. So I gave 2 months notice, unsure of what would be next. And then Paul Saginaw, my business partner, who had been the general manager when I started washing dishes and had left a few years earlier, but he called me 2 days later and said we should check out this little building near the fish market to check out. In Detroit, where he grew up, you could get good deli food. In Chicago, where I grew up, you could get it. Somehow 4.5 months later, we had renovated the entire old building, redone the floors, the walls, made the menu, costed the menu, ordered product, and we opened up on March 15th, 1982 with 2 employees and 1,300 square feet, which I'll let you translate into metric system for your listeners. And fast forwarding, and then I'll stop and we can go back to where you started to ask me. 43 years later, we're overnight success. And today there's like a dozen Zingerman's businesses, each different because we do everything as a unique business, all located here in the Ann Arbor area. So really nothing's more than 15 minutes from anything else. And we have about 700 and something staff members, about 275 of which own a share. And then we do about $80 million in sales collectively. There you go.
Awesome. And so thank you for that. And apologies again for kind of cutting you off, even though it wasn't cut off. It was like, well, you said it wasn't cut off. I was cut off, but you just had your pause. But thank you for backfilling that. And if we could zoom back to the first part, your original experience. So it's actually, you said like it's 40 years kind of later, and you're reflecting on where you kind of started, which almost like the business, the experience of being a dishwasher, but then becoming a line cook.
Yep.
But you put it in this form of the chapbook.
Yeah.
Again.
So chapbooks, it's interesting, but the word chapbook was used in print in the UK. 200, well, now we're in the beginning of 2025, but it was 200 years ago last year.
Okay.
Is the origin. So in your world and customer experience, they don't use chapbooks a lot. But if you were to travel the poetry world, it's quite a common form.
Right.
So that's where I learned about it. But they're little. It's like a chapter book is what it's short for.
Right.
And it was, it's used today a lot for poetry because it can be done in a short form. and you can print small amounts of quantities of them and get them out to the world. But the history of it, which is more interesting, is that both chapbooks and the pamphlets that we do, which are bigger, and I don't know that there's a legal definition of what makes a pamphlet and what makes a chapbook, but the pamphlets as we do them are probably double the size, a little more than the chapbook. But they all were essentially social media 100, 200 years ago. So the idea, although the platforms for social media are relatively recent developments, the idea of social media used to happen in the pub. It still happens in the pub.
Right.
It's just one person sharing a thought with the other and things being passed through word of mouth from one to the next. So now people can do it on Instagram or whatever, but it generally happened at what was called the third place, the place people gathered, the pub, the church, whatever. And then it also could happen through pamphlets because, for whatever the UK equivalent of a nickel was back in the day, you could buy one and then people would read it and pass it on to their friends. And so it was far more affordable and more democratically oriented than a book, which today are really inexpensive, but 150 years ago, 100 years ago, they weren't super cheap. I mean, so, people on the street were much more inclined towards something quick and small, like a pamphlet.
Yeah, I just love the idea because it's like, it's almost a bit like it's almost like I was saying before, it's like we almost like forget things that occur in our history and then they come back again. And it's like quite nice that I love the way that you just kind of revamped brought what is common in a poetry space into sort of a service space or into the business kind of world, because actually it's quite bite-sized.
Yeah, it's very bite-sized. And so I've written these big books, which like including a 600-page book on beliefs, not religion, but like what we believe about books or music or life or human beings or whatever. But this is sort of like a little espresso shot compared to that. So this is more like you could sit and read it, if you were in London commuting, you could probably read it between the time you got on the tube and when you got to where you were going.
Right. And I think that's the kind of thing is that, and that's why I think that then it becomes very relatable. And that's why I thought it was relatable to the sort of the space that we're in, because if we come to the lessons, these life lessons, and as I said before, there's like 18 of them. And I wanted to just like pick out a few of them. And the first one, let's go to the top of the list because it's probably my favorite and a thing that I harp on to many people about is because, in the world of service and experience, we're still talk about transformation this and transformation that and like doing lots of big stuff.
Yeah.
But actually, and this is the life lesson that reads, the little things make a big difference.
Yep.
And I think that's it's funny how, I know you were writing something else earlier or a couple of weeks ago, because if people haven't checked out Ari's newsletter, you should do, because it's you get it and it is like almost an essay in it and it makes you think. And there was a piece you were talking about where people talk about crisis, but they don't necessarily recognize the work that gets done after the crisis to right all that's happened. And this feels like the little things, right, that make the biggest difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's true of everything in life. And it's the situation has become even more exacerbated with social media and quick transportation. I could look up the quote, but it was from Heather Cox Richardson, who writes also an awesome e-news she does every night, shorter than mine, but still fairly extensive. Anyway, she was saying people like to look at the catastrophes and the crises and the drama, but they don't have a lot of interest in the real work of governance that goes on. And this is, of course, without getting into politics, a contrast that we're about to transform from somebody who likes to do the one without drama to the one who doesn't like to do the governance and a lot of drama. So that's true in the workplace too. And so people look from the outside, and let's say in the food world or whatever world you want, a musician, they think the glamour is that you got this award or you got on TV or you had a gold record or you became a famous chef. But the reality is it's mostly the nuance of the little things that make that happen. And the big things are always built on the little things. And in the context of cooking, it's just, a tiny, like salt is the easiest example for me culinarily, because a tiny bit of too much or too little salt can radically alter the dish. So something that's under seasoned can completely, it'll be tasteless. And something that's over salted could have been a beautiful piece of steak or great pasta that you bought, but over salting, which is a tiny thing in the scheme of all the work that goes into a meal. Yeah. And if you want, I'll tell you a very quick, funny story that happened just a couple of weeks ago. So about 10 years ago, I worked the floor at the Roadhouse every night. I pour water and just bus tables or whatever. So one night on the Jewish holidays where we have Marcy Ferris's matzo ball gumbo soup on the menu, Creole matzo ball soup. Anyway, so I was pouring water and this table of young guys was there and the guy goes, "This soup is tasteless. It's terrible." So I knew immediately, of course, it's just not salted properly because broth that's undersalted seems tasteless. So I bring it back. That gets thrown out, of course, but then we go to the batch and of course it's undersalted. So I add the proper amount of salt, bring back the soup, and he loves it. So this was like, it was exactly the same work, but just this tiny amount of salt. Anyway, 2 weeks ago, I'm in there and I'm working the floor and I don't know how it came up, but he goes, "Do you remember I was in here once and I had this soup and you fixed it by adding salt?" I'm like, my God. Of course, I've told this story 1,000 times, but I haven't seen the guy. So whatever, 10, 12 years later, there he was. So it's just a good example. And it's also from a customer service or customer experience example of how it got turned around, because had it not been turned around, we would have lost a customer who would have told everybody for the rest of his life that the food there was terrible. Yeah. But by turning it around and in the context of your work on CX, is to let it get handled well, turned them into a lifetime customer.
I mean, I think that's true. I think it's something I've written about in the past about how these little things, and I call them, it's almost the sort of the grit in our experiences or the insignificances, and sometimes they get overlooked, and the work of identifying them and removing them is the work of commitment, but focus and effort, and it's time, and it's not necessarily the most glamorous or the most sexy kind of thing to do. It doesn't necessarily get the most attention or the most funding or generate the most exciting, but oftentimes, to your point, it's the work of the craft in many ways and can make the biggest difference.
Yeah, agreed. I think it is the work, to be honest. I think people would be wiser to ignore the award and pay more attention to the nuanced details. And, in cooking, it's the salt or the whatever, but in the not overcooking your pasta. I mean, these tiny, 1 minute too long, it can go from great to mediocre. In the service world, it's the simple act of making meaningful eye contact, smiling and greeting the guest.
Right.
It's not glamorous, but it's incredibly important. And, you and we both place high emphasis on it.
Yeah, indeed. So the next one so thank you for that. I mean, the next one I wanted to ask about was the stay humble one. And the reason I wanted to ask about that one is, a lot of the time it feels like there's humility. It doesn't necessarily feel like it's kind of in oversupply right now. Particularly when you got social media and everything else, and everybody's doing the big I am and look at me type of thing. And I wanted to understand what the lesson was that you learned from Eat Like Cook about staying humble and why is that important?
Well, I'll say a couple things. So as you know, I wrote a whole pamphlet on humility, which is up there. The next pamphlet, which I'm working on, is going to be to take this, come back on the podcast and talk in much more detail, but metaphorical organizational ecosystem model that from the e-news I've been working on for many years, which compares different elements, beliefs to the root system, culture to the soil, and humility in that model is topsoil or humus. That was the easiest one to connect since it's actually in the linguistic root of the word. And in fact, of the matter, certainly in the U.S., and I would imagine in Europe the same, or the UK, Scotland, whatever, is that there is a crisis of topsoil erosion. And we know that in the land that without topsoil, the plants don't grow well. And I'm going to suggest metaphorically, it's identical in organizations. Without humility, things don't grow well. Now, you can make stuff grow just like people have topsoil erosion and continue to grow commercial corn in very large quantities, but it's by using a lot of artificial inputs that ultimately damage the ecosystem. So humility is, I think, essential to our organizational health. Again, it doesn't work to promote your humility. There's a joke from, I forget his name, so I apologize, but a Pakistani author in the humility pamphlet that says, my uncle told me the story of how he was awarded a medal for humility, but when he put it on, they took it away from him. Right, which I like. So anyway, but why do you learn it in cook? I mean, I think you could learn it anywhere, but you learn it in cooking because I don't care how famous the chef is. If the line cook doesn't do a good job, the meal will be mediocre,
Mhm.
and also like the way that we work, you mentioned craft, and it's craft work. So the reason that all those chains went to doing everything out of cans and boxes is because they sacrificed an enormous amount of quality. But what they also did is eliminate the worst case scenario because it's already what it is. And all you as the fry cook have to do is drop it in the fryer or throw it on the grill if you're the grill cook.
Yeah.
So the humility is that in our world, there's no guarantee you could have served 100 great meals and then make the next 6 terrible.
Mm.
And that you can't, and also that none of us can do it alone. So I do have a few friends who keep their places tiny,
Mhm.
and it's just like them cooking, and they got like 14 seats or 12 seats, and that's it. But the reality of most of our lives is that we're wholly dependent on other people's work.
Yeah. And yeah, and actually paying attention to that, and actually it's not just about you, but you're actually part of a big chain, and that's important. So the next one I wanted to ask about was this. The next one on the list actually is to foster a connection with art
Yeah.
and beauty,
Yep.
and I thought that was a really interesting one, particularly when we think about how most of the talk these days is about data and about technology and science and all these different sort of things. And it feels like art and beauty gets displaced into be something to do that we need to do is to do with like we should do those things for pleasure and actually has no role in our work
Yeah.
that we do. And so I want to understand the lesson that you learn from the balance, the kind of fostering a connection with art beauty from being a line cook, because I think we should try and gather more of that
Yes.
because it informs us and can add
It
to what we are.
it is us. So
Mm.
yes, I will take the Joe Strummer punk rock anarchist opposite approach, not shockingly. So I'm going to suggest beauty is essential to our existence.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, you know, I mean, there's 100 ways to describe it, but in the food world, there was an American TV cartoon show a million years ago when I was a little kid called The Jetsons, and they
Uh-huh.
made this thing where they were going to eat by all they had was a pill.
Mm.
So the pill was a steak pill or it was whatever. But like no, they could give you the nutrition of your food without having to go through. Like we could all just have ports put in our arms and have
Yeah.
nutrition injected and skip the whole thing. But there's the culinary pleasure of the food. Or in my case, I still go home and cook every night, even though we eat very late, like they do in Spain at
Mm.
our house, me and Tammy. But I like the cooking. The cooking itself is pleasurable, and I like the eating as well. But the two go together. So line cooking, the cooking, the food, the artisan food we work with. There's so much beauty in all of it, and I guess I'll just frame it with the work of John O'Donohue, the Irish philosopher, whose work I am super inspired by. He said that the world is suffering from a crisis of ugliness.
Right.
And he
Yeah.
wrote this, he passed away many years ago. So this was written long before the ugliness of our present era. So you can only imagine how
Mhm.
much worse it might have been seen today. But I think that this is our work. And I wrote about this in the Art of Business pamphlet, which is my belief business
Mhm.
and life are like art or music or poetry. But anyway, he said that in dealing with this crisis of ugliness, of course, the responsibility is in a punk rock way on all of us. It's not for the boss to fix it. It's for each of us. And the way that he said it really touched me. And he said that the famous, well-known saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder,
Mhm.
of course, which is well known, is almost always interpreted to mean beauty is subjective. And so what you like may not, you and I like to clash, but other people might hate it.
Yeah.
But he said there's an equally valid and perhaps even more important interpretation. And he said, and that's that we need to train our eye to see the beauty. And I love that because, and that's really what I touched on in the chapbook. I mean, is that there's beauty everywhere. It's just for us to pay attention. And so, to be honest, even just looking, I can see two particular paintings behind you, even though it's a little blurred intentionally in the background. One is the one with the colors over your right ear, maybe, and the other is the figure with the hands on the face, and it's awesome, right? So it's
Yeah.
just to see that art, just to in a good way, to appreciate the nuance of your accent, to appreciate that we're talking today and connecting our friendship. Like, these are all beautiful things, and they've all happened in the same time we're sitting here creating data.
Yeah. And I think that because the other reason I picked it out, and this is, it sort of made me think about the first track or the first parts of the book Punk CX. It started with a question, which it said, are you an artist or are you just coloring in?
Yep.
And it was the idea of, particularly in a service and experience kind of context, is like many people were going through the same kind of same process and expecting kind of like a differentiated experience or something different, something to stand out, something to wow, something that people are going to engage with. And you're like going, yeah, but where's the art in it? Where's the you? Where's the self-expression, the kind of the big thing that's going to bring this to life, as it were? And I think that otherwise if we don't inject that into it or notice it or accentuate it, then we're just automatons in many ways. And I think also the other thing it made me think about is that, to your point, is that there's beauty all around, right? And sometimes we need to take a moment to go and stop and to look around and to find it or to notice it or even to go and seek it out.
Yep.
And I think that speaks to our busy lives, as it were, and endless meetings and emails and things. And rather than sending somebody an email, why don't you just go around and talk to them? Sort of thing.
Well, and also is that it's there all the time. And so the training the eye, the ear, or the nose or the mouth, whatever, to notice the beauty is, to reframe our thinking so that we see the beauty in the meeting. And to really watch it, like whatever people like, a football match or a band concert, because that's kind of what it is. I mean, it's a jazz concert, and sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. But even in the worst concert, there's still some beautiful sax notes that the musician hit, that are worthy of attention. And I'm a big believer in abundance thinking, as are you. It's not a zero-sum game that I get, more if you get less or whatever. But I would suggest with beauty and ugliness, it is a zero-sum game. And so the more beauty you and I and anybody listening put into the world, the less ugliness. And back to where you started, the drama is often ugly. And it is, it's like an accident, on the highway. When you're driving by, it's hard not to look. But the reality is there's thousands of cars that drove by totally fine, where people were paying close attention and having a lovely conversation with their compatriot in the car.
Right.
But those don't make headlines.
But I think that's, and to that point, I think think about the service experience sort of thing, the thing that doesn't make headlines, the thing that doesn't necessarily get that sort of attention could be what happens when something goes wrong, or what happens when something goes super wrong and somebody makes a complaint. And actually, there's an opportunity, I think, in that sort of thing, is to take something which is potentially an ugly situation and to deal with it with grace and art, and to do something which is counter what people would normally expect. And it doesn't need to be that different. It just needs to be almost like marginally different or marginally better than what they would expect, for them to have a way better sort of experience. But I think what makes me think about is that thinking about things in an artful, or thinking about art and beauty, when you think about these situations, maybe we'll think about things in a slightly different kind of way, because
Yeah.
art and beauty doesn't need to be associated with things. It can also be associated with beauty
Yes.
and experiences.
Yes, 100% agreed. In fact, last week's e-news, which I'm sure you can put the link into the show notes, was about handling guest or customer complaints.
Yeah.
And the recipe that we use. And the essay was based on, to your point, the book, The Beauty of Everyday Things, and pardon my Japanese pronunciation, but by the 20th century Japanese philosopher and art critic, Soetsu Yanagi, who wrote a lot about what came to be called the Minge. I didn't know this till I read his book, but the Minge movement, it's well known in Japan, which was a focus on everyday craft products. So not art for museums, but to see the beauty in simple handmade things like a handmade wooden spoon or whatever that were commonly used, but often just ignored. And he really worked to put it back in. And the two characteristics that he put out for what qualified something to fit this form was, number one, that it had to be simple in its production, and then it had to be so that anybody could use it. And then it also had to be used a lot. So it couldn't just be something that was made to hang on a wall. And when I read that, I was like, yeah, this is like our customer service recipes, because they're super simple. Like, we teach them to everybody who works here. They're used all day long. And I think everybody who works here knows they're helpful, but I don't know that we've really looked at it like an expression of art. But that's really, to your point, what this is.
Awesome. Next one, and there's a cluster of this. We did 5 and did 6, and then the next one I want to do is 7, because this is speak to. This is a lot about kind of what you're about as well. Is like start with purpose.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, what's the lesson you learned as being a line cook that relates to purpose?
Yeah. Well, I think so. Two things that I'll say. So one is any job, any work, and we have dogs, not kids, but I would assume parenting or writing poetry or, playing the piano in a famous band, like, they're all mostly repetition and drudgery. And the world again sees the drama of, like, I just wrote about a bunch about Patti Smith for tomorrow's e-news, and so they see the record or listen to the record she released, and it's amazing, or they read her book and it's amazing, but they don't see the hours and hours and hours that went into it. They don't see, that she was not eating for days because she was working in a bookstore and she couldn't afford to eat, and so any work can be drudgerous, but when we choose, it's a little like the beauty. If we choose to be purposeful in what we do, then it brings it to life in a completely different way. The physical work is no different. So if I'm cooking in the spirit of line cooking, and all I'm doing is like cooking your order so I can get out of work and go home or go to the pub or whatever, it's not evil, but it's not very inspiring. And after years of doing it, it wears you down. Like, what's the point, But if I can remember, which is our organizational work, is to help line cooks remember by sharing customer comments. But, is that I'm cooking for a family, whatever, like that the grandmother's 88 and this might be her last Christmas and they came into our restaurant to eat. Like, the quality of the food that I cook has an enormous impact on the quality of their experience that evening, which, because it's Christmas, might be the last, one of the most prominent days in their memory. So the more I'm thinking about that, there's a young man, I don't know, maybe 10 or 11, named Zach. He's going to come to the book event tonight. So he's been coming in since he was a little kid. He loves our food. Like, he's super into it.
Right.
The piece that I wrote about the life lessons chapbook was in our print newsletter, and his grandfather, I guess, brought it home for him. So they're talking about it. I was like, well, why don't you come tonight? We'll give you a young person's deal for half off or whatever. So he's let me check with my mom. So he's coming. So, I mean, it's just like knowing that when I cook, if I'm the line cook, that I might be cooking a meal for that kid who's now super impassioned about food and sees the beauty in it, and it's changing his life.
Nice. Yeah, no, I like it. I mean, I think it's like staying sort of focused and connecting with, the reason for being. And I think the lesson for me in all of that is that it's because you can think about a line cook and they're not necessarily very visible.
Yeah.
in a restaurant, and they're sort of in the back, as it were.
Yep.
But it means that actually you got to make sure that that everybody in the organization is connected to the
Yeah.
kind of purpose and understands their reason for being there and doing what they do and why it's important.
Yeah. And I'll flip it inside out again too, and not in disagreement with what you said, but in addition to it, I don't go on social media a lot, but I look at various friends or whatever to see what's going on. My friend Patrick Earl Barnes is an artist in New York City. We met walking down the street. I was walking down the street. He was selling his art like 18 years ago. We're still friends.
Right.
Anyway, I was looking at his Instagram, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago. He had this post up that said, "The purpose of my life is to live a purposeful life."
There you go.
And I love that because I have another friend, Vic Strucker, who teaches here at the School of Public Health, who is done a lot of academic work around the power of purpose and its impact physiologically and emotionally and stuff, which is awesome. But then there's the inverse, which is people are looking for purpose and then they're freaking out because they can't figure out what their purpose is. And I love Patrick Earl's post, because it was just like, you don't need a big purpose. Just every time you open the door for somebody, be purposeful.
Yeah.
Every time you salt the fish, be purposeful. Every time you put a piece of fish on the grill, think about the person, the man or the woman that fished it, like these, and what's happening in their community, because we're selling the fish and how it's helping to support sustainable fishery communities. So it's all really a lot in how we frame it.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a thing years and years and years ago when I was just like starting to work, and I was doing these sort of different things, and I just had this little mantra in my head, which was like, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I, in inverted commas, grew up, as it were.
Yep.
So I just started doing some things, and I sort of told myself, I was like, well, just do what you like and what feels good until it doesn't feel any good anymore, and then do something else that makes you feel good, and then just keep going. And as long as you're kind of like focused on that sort of thing, doing things that align with your values and that you enjoy and that you engage with, you realize it's not forever and ever necessarily. It might be, but actually be driven by your sense of what is now.
Yeah,
to Patrick's point.
Absolutely. And it's one of the key beliefs of anarchist philosophy, which helped me enormously, is the understanding that the means that we use, so how we go about doing something, must be congruous with the way that with what we want to achieve. And so the people have socially been trained to wait for retirement or wait for the big vacation or whatever. And it's a long, we'll leave the curse words out, but it's a long wait. And so it's really learning to live today with the beauty and appreciation and joy and humility and vision and all of it that I want to achieve down the road. It won't happen down the road if I don't do it today.
Right.
And so to your point, it's just putting purposefulness into every tiny act, and the understanding that regardless of what we do in the long run, that creates a purpose-filled life.
Yeah, absolutely. And then maybe connected to that one, I wanted to jump forward to get just like another 2 or 3 that I wanted to ask you about. And I want to jump forward into the number 11, which was learn emotional resilience.
I thought for sure you were going to go to 16. Everything is interconnected, because you were saying it was connected. No, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm gonna leave that one as a teaser.
You're good.
I'm not
You're
going to
good.
cover
You're
that
good.
one. But learn emotional resilience, because I think it goes back to kind of some of your earlier kind of points. I'm guessing kind of like, well, I know because I've read it, but it's like, it felt to me when I was reading it and I was just thinking about it, that actually, and related to some of the earlier ones, was like going, maybe there is going to be too much salt, or things are going to spoil, or that's the thing. And there's going to be a bit of a bumpy road. It's never like a straight sort of line. And it's like, it's never easy. And so therefore you've got to bob and weave sometimes.
Absolutely. And so any line cook or really anybody who's doing anything has suffered through the ups and downs. I mean, it's inherent in human existence. Even if the world doesn't change much, my emotional state changes high to low in like 93 seconds. And with email and
Yeah.
text now, dude, I mean, I can go from like, everything's working, it's awesome, to like, oh my God, we're going to be out of business next week, and that could be like 48 seconds apart, so it's often the way it plays out is like one email's this giant compliment and two emails up the chain is a big complaint,
Yeah.
and they both happen at the same time. So yeah, I mean, we need to learn the emotional resilience because you'll never get through. Like, if I had given up or you had given up or whoever that's listening, by definition, honestly, if somebody's listening to this podcast, they have a pretty reasonable level of emotional resilience or they wouldn't even have tuned in. So it's really being able to breathe through the situation. And, I remember there's a woman who worked for us very early on who was awesome as a line cook at the deli. And she was going to med school for OBGYN while she was working. And later, when she became a physician, and I would see her, here and there, she moved out west to Seattle. But anyway, she would say, like, whenever I'm in the operating room and things are getting really crazy and I'm starting to freak out, I go, "You made it through football Saturday at the deli. You can make it through this." And so it is. And then, Paul Saginaw, my business partner early on, he said, "Look, it's just food," and Frank, who's going to be there tonight, who taught me how to line cook, was like, "The shift's going to end and we're going to come back tomorrow." And, in sports, people, even the best teams have terrible games and they got to play it out, so it's like the fourth quarter and they're way behind. They know they're not going to win. But again, the integrity, the congruity of how you play when you're losing by a lot, knowing you're going to lose, carries over into the next game.
And I think that's there. I think there's a possibility that some people don't play the game because they're scared to lose.
Yeah, and I understand that because I have that fear too. I'm afraid of everything. I just learned to go ahead anyway.
Right. But how do you do, because the lesson is to learn emotional resilience. I mean, it's like, what would be your advice to somebody who's going like, well, I'm not really sure I like the idea of the risk and being afraid to play and lose and stuff.
Yeah.
How do we learn that? How do we?
I understand that. I get it. And early on in my life, I would hold stuff back a lot because then I still have that kind of fear every day, But it finally became clear to me through therapy and whatever good conversations with friends, but it's just doing nothing is equally risky. It's just, and so it's a different conversation that we've kind of already had, I think, in previous podcasts, but the Natural Laws of Business essay, which is in the first book in the leadership series I did, Building a Great Business, ninth natural law of business or life, which means it's like gravity, it's just true, is that success means we get better problems. And so, you're going to have a problem. That's not an option. It's not an option to have no problems. As far as I know, it means you're dead. I'm trying not to have that problem. So it's either, do I want the problem of having gone after what I wanted, pushed through to the next day, or do I want the problem of sitting at home lamenting that I didn't? You're going to have one or the other.
Yeah. Awesome. That's great. Yeah, no, I like that. It's just sometimes you just have to just jump in and realize
I don't want to, but it's just like, I know if I'm going to go running today and it's 16 degrees Fahrenheit, which whatever we said, -10 roughly centigrade. And now it's starting to snow, which isn't making me happy, but I'm just going to take a deep breath and,
I mean, and I think
it doesn't matter, as you would say, and go out there.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter necessarily how far you run. I mean, you go out for half an hour or whatever it might be.
No, dude, I'm slow at this age, but I just go every day,
Right. But I think the biggest hurdle is actually stepping over the threshold.
Absolutely.
And just going, because that's the biggest kind of mental barrier. Okay. Last one is that I wanted to talk to. Second last one was diversity matters. What was the lesson that you learned around diversity matters?
Well, there's a number of things. So on any team, line cooking or any other, if you don't have diversity in the team, it's hard to be healthy. So, what one person's good at is going to lead to what the other person's not good at, and vice versa. So we can counterbalance strengths and counterbalance weaknesses through our shared purpose, but our different skill sets. And then also in the artisan food world is just, the diversity does matter because we aren't taking the food out of boxes and cans. Not that we don't use anything boxed or canned, but even then, it's still artisan product. And so it means that each piece of fish is different. Each piece of vegetable is different. Each cheese, that we get from an artisan cheesemaker, it's different every day of the make season.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just appreciating that diversity. And, I was raised like you, I mean, mid 20th century industrial mindset and a lot of work. And so I grew up on the industrial diet, which was the opposite of that, which is, the Kraft macaroni and cheese or,
Yeah.
whatever you call them, fish fingers,
Yeah.
were exactly the same every day. And that was what people aspired to. That was their vision, was to eliminate the diversity. But it's really flat and boring and a lot like a lot of the mid 20th century science fiction books that you and I both probably read too, Brave New World and
Yeah.
1984 and whatever, Yevgeny Zamyatin's book. These were all about what was happening in the societies where there was no diversity because it was all imposed from above and flattened out.
And it makes me think as well, because it circles back to that whole Foster connection with art and beauty and what you said about ugliness and things. And if it's like all the same, or it's like big box stuff, it's all box or canned or whatever, then it's like, and that idea that you want to create something which stands out, which is different. And you can't do that with bland ingredients.
No, my friend Randolph Hodgson from Neal's Yard Dairy many years ago, who does great work down in London, if people are down there, but with cheese. But he said, with the industrial model, what they did is they used, standards to appropriately eliminate, the really terrible cheeses, because you can make bad cheese by hand. Like just doing it by hand doesn't guarantee it's going to be good. But he said in the process, they also got rid of the 9s and the 10s. So they got rid of the 4s and the 5s, but you end up with everything at a 7.
Yeah.
A 6. So nothing's terrible and nothing's great, but it's very flat. And this is what, punk rock really was, to get away from that in music and, stick the thumb in the nose or whatever to the mundanity of life.
Yeah. I mean, and we didn't have, the thing is, here's the thing, you didn't have to like it. It was like a binary thing. It was a kind of on or off. You're either, and you totally get it, or you're like, well, no, I don't. But at least you understood where you felt, what you felt about it.
Yep.
And I think that
not everybody likes our food. I mean, there's some
Right.
people that want to go to the fast food franchise, and I don't begrudge them. And it's a different conversation on dignity, but I can treat them with dignity regardless of what they eat.
Sure.
It's not contingent. It's not a quid pro quo that they come to us and then I'm nice to them. I need to be nice to them no matter what.
Yeah. And then the final one I wanted to ask about is live with paradox.
Yeah.
And I was like, tell me about that one.
Well, it's inherent everywhere. Life is filled with it. Most of us, raised not to like it. I certainly, speaking more personally, was raised with the belief of a more black and white world, and it was either good or bad. And I think I've learned painfully through frustration and study and self-reflection that it's actually, they're both happening at once. So, here's the paradox. I mean, there's a million of them, but, we're faced with, we want to serve this artisan food and pay people better, but we want the food to be really affordable. Well, you can't have both. I mean, it's, because the farmers and the cheesemakers, the fisher folk who are really doing a great job are not making a lot of money either. And we're paying more to get better quality product. And so, because of that, it's going to be expensive. Like, it's just inevitable. The reality of any line cook's life is, like, if you made one plate per night with 5 people working on it for 3 hours, I mean, dude, it would be unbelievable and awesome. But the reality is that's not how it works. So, we're balancing trying to produce a lot of food in a short window of time and do it at a very high quality level. So these paradoxes are inherent in all we do. Like, that if you get a certain fish that's seasonal, it's only available for 6 weeks. If we get strawberries here in Michigan, I don't know what the season is in Scotland. It's probably not dissimilar. It's like 2 weeks out of the year.
Yeah.
So if we don't care about beauty in that way, and we don't care about using the traditional products, and we're not that worried about flavor, we can get supermarket grade commercial strawberries. They just come from a different place in the world. They're never great, but they look red, and on we go. But if you want really the amazing one, the one that's filled with beauty, that's grown by somebody not far from where you are, it's only going to be there for 10, 14 days.
But the thing I think that makes me think about with that is, like, whilst those paradoxes or those trade-offs seem to exist, it's not impossible you don't actually have to settle for them. Sometimes that when you're dealing with perishable things like produce, and seasonal factors, yes, that you're bound by things that you can't control. But there's also it makes me think about other sort of situations within business and stuff, and how people kind of come up with this dominant logic assumptions around how things are.
Yeah.
And I think one of the best examples I had, and it's about how people have creatively tried to solve for the problem. And I remember, so a friend of mine, Richard, who's actually one of the co-authors on Richard Hammond on the Punk XL book, he told me the story. He told me about, I've always been intrigued by the Apple stores, the retail stores.
I thought you were talking about heirloom apples from the orchard.
No. So the Apple kind of
I know. I'm just being a cook. Yeah.
And I've always been intrigued by how they've been able to create this environment where you can go and play around with all the kit, which is unlike many other electronic stores.
Yeah. Yep.
And how it becomes like a magnet for people that are fans of those products. And Richard told me, he says, you know what the interesting thing? They had a guy from, I think it was from Target, that they hired to used to run Target's retail stores. He says the biggest problem in retail is shrinkage. And that's a big drain on the shop operations. And that's why they end up locking lots of stuff down. They over-index on security and stuff. But that run counter, this is the paradox. They're like, well, marketing wants to do this, experience design wants to do this. And operations is going, well, I can't do that because... And they were like going, well, you see that as a cost to your budget. We're just going to see that as an expense that we have to factor into our budgeting. We're willing to take that risk.
Yep.
And so they took away from ops and put it into marketing, and it freed them up to do a thing that nobody else has been willing to replicate.
Yeah.
And I think it's just, for me, it was just an example of creatively trying to solve for that, what is an existing paradox, but sometimes what seems like a paradox, but can be solved if you look at it kind of closely enough.
Yeah. Well, and it's back to natural law number 9. Success means you get better problems. So natural law number 1 is that anybody who's living a great life, personally or organizationally or both, has a vision. Now, whether they write it down the way we do, which is another conversation or not, isn't the point, but they have a vision. So your vision is essentially describing the problems that you want.
Right.
So they chose the problem of, whatever, a few people are going to nick this or nick that, but we're going to make it way more interesting and fun. Right. What many places do, and another one of the natural laws is strengths lead to weaknesses. So people who are very customer focused tend to do, they'll do what the customer wants, but it takes them away from the inspiring part of their vision because the market pulls you to the middle of the road.
Right.
So they end up with trying to have a good experience and everything's locked up. And so you're not really helping the security that great, and you're not really providing a great experience. And what you're describing, I hear with Apple, is they chose to make a great experience, even if there was some additional small cost.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they just broke out that sort of traditional retail kind of like paradoxical kind of model. You got retailers want to do this, but they're stuck with this. And I thought it was an interesting kind of like thing. But like we've covered, I can't remember, is it 7 of them? But there's 18 of them. And we'd be here all evening talking about them. But I think I love the idea that it's in a format chapbook, so it's really short. I love that there's a lot in there, but I love the way that I've been able to relate it to service and sort of experience. I'd encourage everybody to kind of go and check it out, and I will put links in the notes. But if people were to go and try and find it, where's the best place to go and try and find it, Ari?
It's where you and I met, on Zingerman'sPress.com.
There you go.
It's not a dating site. It's a place where we sell our books. So we're in a punk rock way off the grid. We do all the design here. And Jenny Tubbs, who does a remarkably great job at Zingerman's Press, helped Adrian to get his books, despite the formidable, you would say, barrier of shipping costs overseas, because we're not on Amazon, and made it possible. And now here we are 10 or whatever years later. So a lot came out of that. And I guess what I would just say in wrapping up or tying things together. So the big thing of the chapbook actually, so when I took the job cooking the line, my intention was just to pay my rent, and it seemed a lot more interesting than washing dishes. But I didn't take it and go like, dude, one day I'm going to write books about leadership, and it's all going to be based on what I learned about flipping burgers. It wasn't in my mind. And in a good congruous way, when I wrote the chapbook, this wasn't in what I'm going to share with you wasn't in my mind either, but now it is. So it's very parallel. And the content of the chapbook are the 18 lessons, but the lesson of the lessons, which is sort of the macro piece, I would suggest, and I've come to believe very strongly, is that in a very punk rock way, and as this is a quote from Patti Smith that I put in the well, we'll see if it survives the edits, but that it's in the e-news, which is she just said, what I would say, I don't have any particular talents, but if you have a vision and you're determined and you're willing to work at it, anybody could create life lessons and a philosophy from any work that they're doing.
Yeah.
So I happen to get these from line cooking, and I could trace it to that, but you could get it from being a librarian or from being a Lyft driver. It doesn't matter. And it's really less about my lessons and more about everybody listening. Do they want to? And if they want to, are they willing to do the work to find a philosophy of their own that's true to them, that comes out of whatever work it is that they're doing? So to your point about framing, we can frame any work as drudgery, because it has drudgery. Mine does too. Certainly being a line cook has plenty of it. Or we can frame it as, this is a chance to really create a meaningful philosophy that I can live my life with, and to really shape it into something that's truly our own. And I'll just close with what I've been writing about, which is this idea that I learned from a woman named Carol Sanford, who just passed away last month in her 80s. And she calls it deep understanding. And I think that the chapbook, essentially, I didn't know it when I wrote it because I just learned about this summer, but is really me taking an approach of what I would now call deep understanding of line cooking. So you could go through 43 years of cooking the line and not come up with any of these life lessons, get your paycheck, and you'd be fine, and then retire and go, whatever, to the south of Spain. But similarly, at the same time, you could also get deep understanding. And deep understanding fits this bill very nicely. 4 characteristics very quickly. One is that it's in a line of work that already has existed for a long time. So there's no secret that I didn't invent line cooking. The second is that you take it and you turn it into something of your own, like by, as you said, connecting things that might not be connected. So that's what this is. The third is it's done in a way that helps other people, which is my hope from the chapbook, that people who read it or listen to the podcast at least are benefiting from the work. And last but not least is that it helps me, the author in this case, or you, if it's you, to become yourself in a more grounded and authentic way. And I think that those 4 things can come out of any job.
I think it's a perfect reflection to end on, and absolutely right. I'm just going to leave it there. And I'm just going to say, Ari, it's always a delight to have a bit of a rummage around with you on the podcast. I normally finish with some quick fire questions. Well, I'm going to I'm going to sack them off today, because I think that feels like deep understanding feels like a good place to finish. And so, sir, always a pleasure, always a delight.
Back at you.
Thank you for the life lessons. We will put all the links in the show notes and things.
Yeah, and you can share my email too. It's fine.
And I will put your email in there as well if anybody's got any questions and they want to kind of email kind of Ari direct. But that's awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, man. A pleasure. Cheers.
Wow, what a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinscoe.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. And do tune in again. Thanks very much.